On the night of October 3, 1842, at Briar Oaks Plantation in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, two girls entered the world within hours of each other. One was born in the big house, under clean linen, candlelight, and the strained authority of a white mistress determined to preserve her standing. The other was born in a cabin behind the sugar storehouse, in pain, blood, and the aftermath of a crime everyone around her had agreed not to name aloud. The woman in the big house was Evelyn Beauregard, wife of planter Edmund Beauregard, a man whose wealth rested on land, sugar, and the legal ownership of human bodies. The woman in the cabin was Rose Carter, an enslaved black woman of 19, known on the plantation for quiet obedience, quick hands, and the misfortune of being noticed too often by the master. That is how such records should be spoken now. Plainly. Rose was not seduced. She was not involved in an affair. She was not the keeper of some forbidden romance. She was repeatedly raped by Edmund Beauregard, and like so many crimes committed under slavery, it was treated inside the household, not as a violation, but as a domestic inconvenience to be managed. That is the first fact worth fixing in memory. The second is this. The woman forced to stand between those two births was a black midwife named Silas May Carter, then about 46 years old, known across 3 adjoining properties for delivering babies, stopping hemorrhages, and keeping women alive with little more than herbs, cloth, and nerve. She was also mute. Whether she had been born that way or silenced by injury years earlier, the records do not say. Men like Edmund Beauregard did not preserve the histories of women like Silas May unless their labor could be priced. But silence, in that house, was useful. A mute midwife could witness everything and, in the eyes of the law, testify to nothing. Just after midnight, Evelyn Beauregard's labor turned difficult. A maid was sent running for Silas May. By the time the midwife arrived at the main house, Rose had already delivered her child in the quarters. A healthy infant girl, light-skinned enough that no one who looked carefully could fail to understand what that meant. Rose knew it. The older women around her knew it. The overseer's wife, who hovered near the doorway long enough to count fingers and note the child's complexion, knew it too. This was not mystery. It was evidence in swaddling cloth. Around 2 in the morning, Evelyn gave birth to a girl of her own. What happened between those 2 births was not an accident of panic. It was not a desperate mistake made in confusion. It was an operation, deliberate, ordered, enforced. According to later testimony attributed to house servants who survived the war, Edmund Beauregard entered Evelyn's room before dawn with the kind of coldness men mistake for control. He had already been told about Rose's child. He had already understood the danger. A light-skinned baby born to an enslaved woman on his property, on the very same night his wife delivered her own daughter, threatened more than gossip. It threatened lineage. It threatened the fragile theater by which white planter families pretended their bloodlines were clean, disciplined, and ordained by God rather than soaked in coercion. So Edmund chose the solution slavery always preferred: transform a crime into paperwork. Silas May was ordered to bring both infants. Evelyn, exhausted but conscious, is said to have understood the scheme almost immediately. That detail matters. Too often, histories like this are cleaned for comfort. Too often, the mistress is cast as ornamental, passive, trapped in a man's world yet untouched by its cruelties. But plantation order did not sustain itself on male violence alone. It required female cooperation, female discipline, female willingness to let another woman's child be buried under a lie if it meant preserving a family name. Evelyn Beauregard did not have to invent the system to serve it faithfully. Silas May refused at first. Not with words. She had none to give. But she stepped back. She held Rose's baby tighter. She shook her head. One witness later claimed Edmund struck a side table so hard a porcelain basin cracked. Another said he pulled aside a curtain cord and pointed toward the yard where the whipping post stood black against the last hours of night. Threats on plantations did not need much elaboration. Sale, beating, mutilation, burial without record. Those were the grammar of power. Then came the threat that likely ended the resistance. Rose would be sold south by week's end, and the newborn with her, unless Silas May obeyed. If she still refused, both women would disappear, and no ledger in Louisiana would ever say why. That is how forced silence works. It is not merely the absence of speech. It is speech surrounded by consequences. Sometime before sunrise on October 4, 1842, the exchange was made. Rose Carter's daughter, the child carrying Edmund Beauregard's blood, was placed in the nursery of the big house, wrapped in finer cloth, and prepared to be entered into family record as Helena Beauregard. Evelyn Beauregard's biological daughter was taken from the mistress's room and carried out of the house before first light. That infant, born with every legal protection whiteness and legitimacy could promise, was stripped of both before she had even opened her eyes to the day. She was renamed Clara and attached not to inheritance, but to inventory. There should be no polite language for this. A child was not merely switched, she was demoted into property. By breakfast, the house had already begun correcting reality. The Plantation ledger prepared later that week listed the birth of Miss Helena Beauregard with no sign of irregularity. In a separate notation, tucked among transactions involving feed, tools, and labor counts, appeared the record of an enslaved female infant assigned to the Carter line. No father named, no extraordinary remarks. That is how evil often survives history, not by screaming, but by filing itself neatly. Rose was allowed to live, but only because the lie required her breathing under supervision. A dead mother invites questions. A broken one can be managed. She was forbidden from nursing the child in the big house. Another enslaved woman was ordered to do that work. Rose was sent back to labor before her body had healed. Those who remembered her later said something hardened in her face after that week. Not madness, not surrender, recognition. The kind that comes when a person sees, with full clarity, that the law around her is not failing by accident. It is functioning exactly as designed. As for Clara, the true daughter of the Beauregard household, she was moved into the quarters and raised among people instructed never to say what they suspected. But blood has a way of making tyrants nervous. As she grew, servants noticed features the family preferred not to discuss. The line of the nose, the gray-green cast in the eyes, the shape of the chin that appeared too often in Beauregard portraits hanging in the front hall. Not enough to save her, only enough to make her presence dangerous. And Helena, the stolen child of Rose Carter, was raised in the upper rooms under lace, French primers, and etiquette lessons, taught to carry herself like inherited privilege. She was the living cover placed over a sexual crime. She was not guilty of it. But she benefited from a theft arranged before she could speak. That, too, deserves to be said carefully. Under slavery, innocence did not protect a person from becoming part of an atrocity. Sometimes a cradle itself was made into evidence. Through all of it, Silas May remained on the plantation. That was Edmund's mistake. Men like him believed terror solved everything. They believed that if a woman could not speak, she could not accuse. But mute did not mean blind. It did not mean forgetful. It did not mean loyal. Silas May watched Helena carried to baptism in white linen that should never have been hers. She watched Clara's name spoken with the clipped indifference reserved for assets. She watched Rose lower her eyes in public and clutch her own wrists in private, just to keep from reaching toward the wrong child. She watched Evelyn preserve herself by calling order what was, in fact, desecration. And she remembered. That is the detail the powerful always underestimate. Records can be falsified, churches can be pressured, births can be renamed. But memory, especially the memory of the violated, the witness, the woman ordered to hold the lie in her own hands, does not disappear just because a court refuses to hear it. So when people speak of great Southern houses and their polished genealogies, they should remember nights like this one. They should remember that beneath the language of family, refinement, and legacy often sat fraud, rape, and stolen kinship. They should remember that some daughters were made ladies by violence, and some were made slaves by signature alone. And they should remember the woman in the middle, Silas May Carter, forced into silence not because she knew nothing, but because she knew too much. The crime at Briar Oaks did not end that night. It was only sealed that night. Then it was fed, clothed, educated, and hidden for years under the ordinary routines of plantation life. That is what makes it worth naming in full, not because it was rare, but because it was possible. Because a society built on ownership could rearrange blood, motherhood, and destiny before dawn, and still sit down to breakfast as if heaven approved. If you're listening from somewhere touched by hidden family history, stolen names, or buried truths, comment your city and country below. Let the record show how far these stories still travel. From 1842 to 1858, the lie at Briar Oaks Plantation was not merely preserved, it was cultivated. Fed, dressed, protected with the same discipline that kept the cane fields cut, the books balanced, and the enslaved in line. That is what must be understood about crimes of this kind. They do not survive for 16 years on fear alone. They survive because a household, then a parish, learns to live inside them. By the winter of 1843, the two girls had already been assigned their separate worlds. In the upper rooms of the main house, the child entered in the family record as Helena Beauregard, slept beneath mosquito netting and embroidered linen. Her milk was measured, her fevers were monitored. Her gums were rubbed with brandy when teething came. When guests visited, Evelyn Beauregard presented the infant with solemn pride, as if God himself had signed the baptismal certificate. The priest from St. Martin Chapel, Father Luke Moreau, performed the rite without public hesitation. Whether he noticed the timing, the whispers, the strained faces in the room, no record says. But priests in plantation country often recognized more than they admitted. Their silence, too, had value. At the same time, in the quarters behind the smokehouse, the other infant was learning hunger early. She was called Clara, with no surname the law cared to preserve. No christening feast, no silver cup. No witness invited, except those forced to stand nearby. She was wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared. Her cradle was a wooden box lined with worn cotton. Her mother, Rose Carter, was back at labor before the bleeding had fully stopped. On paper, Clara was an enslaved female child attached to the Carter line. In practice, she was the biological daughter of the very house that claimed absolute right to own her. That is not irony. It is slavery in its purest form, a system so morally diseased it could enslave its own blood and still call itself ordered. By 1846, the differences between the girls had become ritual. Helena's hands were kept soft. Clara's hands were taught usefulness. Helena learned to hold a spoon correctly before she learned to write. Clara learned to carry kindling, rinse blood from aprons, and stay out of the overseer's path. Helena was corrected for posture. Clara was corrected for existing too loudly. One child was groomed for visibility, the other for erasure. Yet the house could never fully erase the visual problem living inside it. As Clara grew, people noticed. Not openly, not in front of Edmund Beauregard, not in ways that could be quoted back as accusation. But plantation life ran on observation. Enslaved women saw what mistresses pretended not to see. Stable boys compared faces without meaning to. Housemaids carried impressions from room to room with the dinner plates. Clara had a complexion that did not settle neatly into the categories the Beauregards preferred. Her skin remained lighter than many around her, though not pale enough to be mistaken for white. Her eyes carried a gray-green cast unsettlingly similar to those seen in the Beauregard portraits. Her chin sharpened with age into something that echoed Edmund's own family line more clearly than Helena's ever did. This is where people in power become most dangerous, when the evidence begins to breathe. By 1848, Evelyn Beauregard had adopted a method seen often in households built on concealed shame. She overcompensated. Helena was not merely treated as a daughter, she was displayed as one. Tutors were brought from Opelousas twice a month to teach basic reading, catechism, and French pronunciation. A piano arrived by flatboat in late spring, walnut-framed and absurdly polished for a district where children in the quarters lacked shoes. Helena's dresses were trimmed with imported ribbon. Her birthdays were marked. Her illnesses produced panic. Every visible act of maternal devotion served the same purpose, to make the public performance so elaborate that no one would dare question the origin beneath it. Clara received the inverse lesson. She was not to expect tenderness, not to linger near mirrors, not to ask why the mistress's daughter wore a coral bracelet that had once been seen tied to another infant's cloth, not to wonder why Rose Carter went silent whenever Helena passed too close. The girl was trained, as enslaved children often were, through correction before comprehension. A sharp tug by the arm, a warning glance, a night without supper, all meant to teach one commandment before all others: know your place, even if your place is counterfeit. And Rose did know. Every day. There is a habit in softened storytelling to portray enslaved mothers as symbols only of grief or endurance. But grief in slavery was rarely passive. It had to be managed like a fever, contained enough to survive, never cured. Rose Carter watched her own daughter pass through the yard in polished shoes. She heard Helena laugh from open windows, while Clara coughed through winter nights in the quarters. She washed linen from the main house that still carried the scents of rosewater and soap, while her own child wore hand-me-downs cut from feed sacks. And still she lived. That fact should not be romanticized. Survival under such conditions was not triumph. It was evidence of how much suffering a human being can be forced to carry without public collapse. Silas May Carter carried her own form of record. Because she could not speak, the house mistook her for resigned. Edmund made use of her through the years, summoning her for births on nearby farms, fevers in the quarters, and the endless female injuries slavery produced and refused to name. She moved through every layer of Briar Oaks with the invisibility of labor that becomes indispensable. That was his second mistake. The woman who had been ordered to swap the children was allowed to remain close enough to measure the consequences. She noticed things others dismissed. The way Helena, even as a child, reached instinctively toward Rose instead of Evelyn during one frightening thunderstorm in 1850. The way Clara, at age 8, paused beneath the front hall portraits as if studying a resemblance she had no vocabulary to defend. The way Evelyn flinched whenever Helena's complexion darkened in summer, then relaxed once winter light softened it again. The way Edmund never looked too long at either girl when both stood in view. Guilt, in such houses, rarely confesses. It rearranges furniture. It shortens glances. It changes the subject. By 1852, Helena was 10 and being openly discussed as a future ornament of the Beauregard name. Letters mentioned possible schooling with relatives in New Orleans once she came of proper age. Visitors described her as delicate, well-bred, a credit to Mrs. Beauregard's care. Such phrases deserve suspicion. In slave country, compliments were often masks stretched over crimes no one wished to inspect too closely. Helena had done nothing to earn blame, but everything surrounding her had been purchased with theft. She was the house's most successful forgery, and like all successful forgeries, she was protected, not because she was false, but because too many reputations depended on her being accepted as authentic. Clara, meanwhile, entered that dangerous age when an enslaved girl's body ceased to be read as merely useful and began to be assessed as available. By 1854, she was 12 and already tall for her age, quick with numbers, quicker with silence. She had been moved between the kitchen, laundry, and sewing room, wherever labor was needed and scrutiny could be maintained. Evelyn insisted she remain close to the house, but never too close to Helena. Not because of infection, not because of discipline, because proximity threatened recognition. There are records from plantations across Louisiana showing how often households separated children who resembled the wrong men. Briar Oaks did not invent that instinct. It simply practiced it with unusual precision. By 1856, the rumors had matured into that most southern of institutions, controlled whispering. No one accused the Beauregards directly. Direct accusation could get a man ruined, a woman cast out, an enslaved person whipped senseless or sold. But comparisons circulated in the safe language of indirection. Clara has the old Beauregard eyes. Helena does not resemble Evelyn's people much, does she? Rose's first child came awfully near the mistress's delivery, if memory serves. That is how communities participate in evil without confronting it. They lower their voices, protect themselves, and let the lie continue as long as it remains inconvenient to challenge. And the law, as usual, stood not above the corruption but beneath it, holding it up. Under Louisiana slave codes, Clara's status followed the condition assigned to her mother. Once recorded as enslaved, she could be sold, punished, hired out, and denied every claim that blood might otherwise suggest. No resemblance to Edmund mattered. No whispered doubt altered the ledger. No moral fact outweighed property law. This is why genealogies in slave societies must never be mistaken for truth. A book can tell you who benefited from power. It cannot, on its own, tell you who belonged to whom in blood, in grief, or in theft. By 1858, the two girls stood at the edge of womanhood, and the lie had become harder to manage. Helena, 16, moved through the world with the confidence of someone trained to expect doors to open. She read French well enough to charm visitors. She played piano competently. She wore morning gray at funerals, pale blue in summer, cream for Sunday calling. Young men from neighboring families had begun to notice her. Evelyn counted that as victory. She should have counted it as the final tightening of a noose. Every year Helena spent in public view deepened the fraud. Every courtship discussed in her name drew more people into a deception built from rape and stolen maternity. Clara, also 16, had become impossible to classify without discomfort. She was too poised for the role assigned to her, too observant, too composed under insult. She had learned to read in secret, first from torn prayer leaflets, then from Helena's discarded primers stolen and returned without detection. She carried herself with a restraint that unsettled people who preferred their enslaved girls visibly broken or theatrically cheerful. The house saw danger in that. Not rebellion yet, something worse. Self-possession. And Rose saw the collision coming before anyone said it aloud. A child raised in silk and a child raised as property cannot live forever under one roof without the structure of the lie beginning to buckle. Silas May saw it too. She had watched 16 years of stolen roles harden into living personalities. One girl was inheriting privilege that originated in her mother's violation. The other was being denied her name so completely that even her own face had become incriminating evidence. This is what should be recorded carefully. Briar Oaks did not merely exchange two infants in 1842. It spent the next 16 years manufacturing opposite destinies out of one act of coercion. It taught one child entitlement and the other submission. It taught the parish to ignore resemblance. It taught the church to bless what it did not challenge. It taught a mother to endure the daily sight of her own child being raised by the household that had violated her body. And it taught a mute midwife that memory, if held long enough, can become a weapon sharper than testimony. By the end of 1858, nothing had been repaired. Nothing had been confessed. But the secret was no longer sleeping. It was walking through the yard in two separate bodies, growing older, drawing attention, and carrying within it the ruin of everyone who had profited from silence. By the spring of 1859, the crime at Briar Oaks Plantation had matured into something worse than a hidden sin. It had become structure. That is the point people often refuse to face when they look back at slave estates and speak only of cruelty in the abstract. The original act, the rape of Rose Carter, the forced switching of the infants on October 4, 1842, was not left behind as an ugly beginning. It was converted into order. The household built itself around it. Meals were served beneath it. Property contracts rested on it. Prayers were spoken over it. A lie repeated for 17 years ceased to be treated as a lie at all. It became the operating floor beneath every daily act. That is how evil protects itself, not only through violence, but through routine. By March 1859, Edmund Beauregard was 53 and increasingly concerned with legacy. His sugar yields had been uneven after difficult weather along parts of St. Landry Parish, and neighboring planters had begun consolidating influence through marriage alliances, debt restructuring, and favorable legal arrangements in Opelousas and New Orleans. Men like Edmund always spoke about stability when they meant control. And by then, stability at Briar Oaks depended on one thing above all others. No one could be allowed to question the legitimacy of Helena Beauregard. Helena was 16 going on 17, polished enough for company, composed enough for a drawing room, and valuable enough to be discussed not as a person, but as a social instrument. Evelyn Beauregard had seen to that. The girl's French was respectable, her posture was trained, her handwriting was neat. She could manage the piano well enough to flatter visitors who wanted to believe refinement could grow untouched in the middle of a slave economy. But the uglier truth remained fixed beneath every compliment. The daughter, being prepared for family advancement, was the child of an enslaved woman who had been raped by the master of the house. This matters because slavery did not merely exploit black bodies in the fields. It consumed female reproductive life and then rearranged its consequences for white convenience. Helena's status was not an accident of affection. It was the result of deliberate theft, of maternity, of name, of legal place. Rose Carter's violation had been repackaged as Evelyn's maternal triumph. Edmund's assault had been converted into a future marriage asset. That is what the plantation had done. And it did not stop there. At the same time, Clara, the biological daughter of Edmund and Evelyn Beauregard, lived under the law as enslaved property. By the time she was 17, she had become one of the most carefully watched people on the estate. Not because she was openly rebellious, not because she had attempted to flee, but because her very existence was a standing contradiction. She moved with a self-command that unsettled the household. Her bearing was too restrained, too observant, too naturally assured for the role assigned to her. The resemblance people had whispered about in her childhood had sharpened rather than faded. The Beauregard chin, the cold, pale cast in the eyes, the precise line of the mouth visible in a faded portrait of Edmund's dead sister that still hung in the side parlor. No court would have admitted that resemblance as proof, but the human eye is often more honest than the law. By April 1859, the plantation had effectively split into two narratives. In the front rooms, Helena was spoken of as the future of the family's domestic image. In the workyards and service spaces, Clara was spoken of with that dangerous mixture of pity and apprehension reserved for a person everyone knows has been wronged, but no one feels safe defending. Housemaids lowered their voices when she passed. Older women in the quarters watched her with a kind of tired dread, because they had seen enough life to understand what happened to girls whose beauty, blood, or intelligence made white households uneasy. Such girls were rarely left in peace. They were managed, used, hidden, hired out, married off without recognition, or destroyed. That is not melodrama, it is historical habit. Rose Carter, by then in her mid-30s, had spent nearly 17 years living inside a punishment more refined than the whip. The lash scars on a body can be counted. The slow mutilation of motherhood is harder to record. She had been forced to watch Helena taught to curtsy, to read, to receive visitors, while Clara washed sheets, hemmed garments, and stood in doorways waiting to be told where to carry the next load. There is a cruelty specific to slavery that did not merely steal a child once. It required the mother to witness the theft reenacted daily through privilege, language, and public recognition. Rose did not need a confession from anyone in the house. She had the evidence every morning. And Silas May Carter watched all of it. The midwife, then around 63, had become more than a witness. She had become the last living archive of the original crime. Plantation power had misjudged her because it understood silence only as absence. But the silence of a forced witness often becomes storage. Silas May remembered what cloth each baby had been wrapped in. She remembered which infant had cried first. She remembered the bruise on Rose's wrist from Edmund's grip the week before the birth. She remembered the exact expression on Evelyn's face when the order was given. Not confusion, not maternal panic, but calculation under strain. These details matter because large crimes are often preserved through small physical facts. A stain, a seal, a gesture, a missing name. History is built from such remnants when official records are designed to lie. And Silas May had begun, quietly, to keep remnants. Sometime in May 1859, according to later accounts pieced together from surviving testimony, she retrieved an old linen wrap from a locked chest beneath the floorboards of her cabin. The cloth had once been used during the births on the night of the switch. It bore a hand-sewn edge in blue thread, a mark Rose had put in place during pregnancy because she had little else to claim as hers. That wrap had disappeared from the cabin after the birth and briefly appeared in the nursery before being replaced. Silas May had noticed. She noticed everything. She also preserved a broken wax fragment from a parish notation associated with the baptism entry prepared that week in October 1842. To people who do not understand how fear works, such objects may sound trivial. They are not. Under systems built on denial, small surviving objects can become the only evidence that the public record was staged. By early summer, June 1859, another issue had begun to trouble Edmund Beauregard more visibly: inheritance talk. He had no acknowledged surviving son in robust health capable of straightforward succession. Family discussions increasingly circled around cousins, nephews, and property fragmentation. Helena's future marriage could help stabilize that problem. A strategically arranged match would protect the estate's social standing and carry the Beauregard name forward through alliance. That, in his view, made her too important to risk. Clara, by contrast, represented risk without value, not actual lack of value. She was intelligent, capable, and of the bloodline he pretended to protect, but value the system could not admit without exposing itself. So the household did what such households always do. It converted threatened truth into tighter surveillance. Clara's tasks were shifted more often. She was kept close enough to the house to be monitored, yet far enough from Helena to limit direct familiarity. She was discouraged from speaking with visitors. Rose was warned twice that summer for insolence, though no clear insolence was described. In slaveholding language, insolence often meant little more than carrying pain without appearing broken by it. It was around this same period that Father Luke Moreau returned more frequently to Briar Oaks for household devotions and estate matters involving the Beauregards' charitable standing. Priests in plantation districts often occupied a compromised position, publicly guardians of moral order, privately dependent on planter patronage. Moreau had baptized Helena in infancy. He had watched her grow. He had also seen Clara often enough to know the house contained a tension no sermon ever addressed. Whether he consciously understood the full crime cannot be proven. But moral negligence does not require complete knowledge. It requires enough knowledge to suspect evil and still choose comfort over confrontation. That choice was common. It kept parishes funded and reputations intact. By August 1859, the heat on the plantation was heavy, and so was the strain within the household. Helena had begun receiving more formal visitors. Letters arrived with seals from relatives and neighboring families. Evelyn supervised conversations about possible introductions and future prospects. The language was clean: breeding, suitability, domestic accomplishment. But behind it stood a rotten foundation. Every proposal discussed in Helena's name involved transferring social value built from rape. Every compliment paid to Evelyn's motherhood praised a fiction enforced through threats against Rose and Silas May. Every step toward Helena's future deepened the dispossession of Clara, whose rightful place had been buried under 17 years of paperwork and fear. This is where the moral infection of the estate becomes impossible to deny. Edmund's original assault on Rose was not treated as a private vice. It became the seed of a public strategy. The household used it, the church blessed around it, the legal system protected it. And the wider planter class, whether fully informed or not, benefited from the same code of silence that made such transformations possible. By the autumn of 1859, the women at the center of the crime had each been assigned a role the house thought permanent. Rose was expected to endure. Helena was expected to embody legitimacy. Clara was expected to submit. Silas May was expected to remain silent until death. That was the plan. It failed for one reason. Memory does not always decay on schedule. Silas May had begun to notice something else that year. Helena and Clara, though raised in opposite worlds, had developed habits that exposed the artificiality of the arrangement. Helena possessed flashes of reserve and watchfulness that seemed to come not from Evelyn's training, but from Rose's bloodline and temperament. Clara, despite every effort to grind her down, carried herself with a natural authority that no kitchen discipline could fully strip away. The plantation had forced two lives into false channels, but blood, character, and history kept surfacing in ways power could not entirely manage. And beneath all of it lay the deeper obscenity. The house had built its idea of nobility upon sexual violence and infant theft, then demanded respect for the result. So when later generations speak lazily of family secrets in old Southern houses, they should be corrected. This was not a secret in the harmless sense. It was not eccentric ancestry, not whispered romance, not a misunderstanding sealed by time. It was a criminal arrangement sustained through race law, female coercion, church silence, and property logic. A child born from rape was elevated not out of mercy, but because her appearance and timing made her useful. A legitimate daughter was reduced to livestock status because truth endangered inheritance. The crime was not merely that the babies were switched. The crime was that the switch became a social system. By the end of 1859, Briar Oaks was no longer just preserving an old lie. It was living off the interest of it. Helena's future, Clara's bondage, Rose's daily torment, Evelyn's respectability, Edmund's legacy, All of it depended on keeping the night of October 3rd to 4th, 1842, buried. But buried things do not become harmless. They ferment. They gather pressure. And sometimes the person everyone discounted, the mute woman, the grieving mother, the girl written into the wrong life, becomes the vessel through which the hidden record returns. That pressure was building now. Not in speeches, not in court, not yet, but in objects preserved under floorboards, in glances avoided across dinner rooms, in the way Clara's face kept betraying the family that denied her, in the way Rose's silence had hardened into something more dangerous than despair, and in the old midwife's refusal to forget. The house believed the crime had been absorbed into normal life. That was its most fatal illusion. Because once a sin becomes foundation, every wall built upon it is already cracked. By the opening months of 1860, the secret at Briar Oaks Plantation had entered its most dangerous phase. For nearly 18 years, the lie had been contained by architecture, race law, church manners, and the disciplined terror of plantation life. But lies of blood do not remain still forever. They begin to move through the bodies of the young. They appear in gestures, in desire, in proximity, in the instinctive pull between people who have been placed in the wrong relations to one another. And that is where the Beauregard fraud began to rot in public. The name at the center of that new danger was Julian Beauregard. Julian, born in 1838, was the son of Edmund Beauregard's deceased older brother, Theodore Beauregard, and by 1860 he had become the young male figure most closely tied to the estate's future standing. At 22, he had been educated just enough to carry family arrogance with polish. He rode well, dressed carefully, and spoke with the confidence of a man raised to assume that other people's lives existed for his convenience. That detail matters. Men like Julian were often excused by their era, their age, or their supposed ignorance. But slave society did not merely inherit cruelty, it trained it. It trained young white men to confuse access with affection, authority with merit, and possession with love. Julian returned to Briar Oaks for an extended stay in February 1860, officially to assist Edmund with estate affairs and discuss longer-term succession concerns. Sugar profits had been unstable. Tensions in national politics were growing. Families like the Beauregards had begun looking inward, counting assets, measuring alliances, tightening bloodline claims. In such a climate, a young male relative with the right surname and acceptable social standing became useful. Julian was treated accordingly. He was invited into ledgers, into legal conversations, into dinner table matters from which women and enslaved people were excluded. He was being prepared, if not as direct master, then as one of the men responsible for protecting the family's continuity. And then he noticed Clara. To say he merely saw her would be too mild. Clara had been visible for years. He had crossed paths with her before. But in 1860, she was no longer a child on the edge of the household. She was 17, nearly 18, and impossible to dismiss without effort. She had the composure of someone trained by pain not to waste movement. She worked often within sight of the main house now, in the sewing room, the back gallery, the pantry corridor, the dairy yard. She carried water, linen, account scraps, baskets of pressed clothes. She kept her eyes lowered when required, but not in the broken way the household preferred. Her restraint itself could read as accusation. Julian began lingering where her duties took her. At first, the behavior could be passed off as idle curiosity. A few extra seconds on the back steps, questions that did not require asking. Requests for water he could have fetched from any servant. But plantation houses were ecosystems of observation. The cook noticed. The housemaids noticed. Rose noticed almost immediately. Silas May noticed before any of them could speak of it safely. Even Helena, though less aware of the deeper danger, is said to have remarked once in March 1860 that Julian seemed oddly interested in the quiet sewing girl. That phrase alone reveals the corruption of the system. Clara was not seen first as a person, certainly not as a wronged daughter of the household. She was seen as a category, a girl in service, a body within reach, a figure whose silence could be interpreted as mystery, modesty, or consent, depending on what the powerful wished to believe. Julian's pursuit deepened through the spring. By April 1860, He had begun inventing reasons to summon Clara indirectly. A torn cuff to be mended, though another seamstress stood closer. A ledger ribbon misplaced, though the office boy had just left. A request for fresh lamp oil delivered through staff instead of handled by a field hand. None of this was romantic in any clean sense. Plantation men often disguised appetite as courtly interest when dealing with women they believed beneath legal protection. The system had taught them that desire did not need moral justification if race and ownership had already removed consequence. But this case carried an extra layer of poison. Julian did not know that Clara was the true biological daughter of Edmund and Evelyn Beauregard. He knew only what the house allowed him to know. She was an enslaved young woman attached to the Carter line, kept unusually near the main residence, spoken of cautiously, and curiously difficult to classify. He found her more arresting than Helena. That fact alone should have alarmed the family, not because of jealousy or impropriety in the drawing room sense, but because the hidden architecture of kinship was beginning to rebel against the false one. The wrong girl had the face of the house. The wrong girl drew the heir's eye. The wrong girl made the lie unstable simply by existing. And Clara herself understood enough to fear it. Women in bondage did not need legal education to recognize danger. They learned it from tone, timing, and the small shifts in a man's behavior when he stopped seeing them as labor and started seeing them as private opportunity. Clara had watched other girls on neighboring properties disappear into that pattern. A compliment followed by a summons followed by expectation, resistance followed by punishment. She knew what happened when white male attention settled on an enslaved girl's body and refused to move. So she withdrew where she could. She shortened answers. She avoided the garden path Julian favored near dusk. She traded certain indoor tasks for heavier work outside when possible. But avoidance on a plantation is rarely mistaken for innocence. It is more often treated as challenge. By May 1860, Julian had begun framing his interest in the language of sentiment. This, too, deserves scrutiny. Slave societies often produced the most self-serving versions of love, especially when white men desired women they had social power to endanger. Julian told one cousin during a visit from New Iberia that Clara had something uncommon in her carriage. He remarked to Helena that some women possessed more true feeling outside polished society than within it. Such lines were not proof of depth. They were evidence of a familiar plantation delusion, the fantasy that crossing social boundaries became noble when motivated by male emotion, even if the structure underneath remained ownership. Clara did not misread his gaze. Neither did Rose. Rose Carter had lived too long under Edmund's violence to confuse admiration with safety. She knew that men of that house did not have to force a woman in the same manner every time. Sometimes they used fear, sometimes gifts, sometimes special treatment, sometimes the language of rescue. But the core remained the same. The white male will moved first, and the black woman was expected to bear the cost. Rose began trying, quietly, to keep Clara away from household interiors when Julian was present. She asked other women to swap tasks. She endured reprimands for disorder in the work rotation. Better that than allowing proximity to ripen into catastrophe. Evelyn Beauregard also noticed, though her concern was not moral. By early June 1860, Evelyn had become visibly tense whenever Julian and Clara were in the same space. She cut conversations short. She reassigned Clara out of parlors and into service corridors. She scolded Helena for letting servants remain too long in receiving rooms. This was not the behavior of a woman suddenly discovering principle. It was the reflex of someone who sensed the edges of a buried crime becoming visible. If Julian's interest in Clara became talk, people would ask why this particular enslaved girl had such a face, such bearing, such unsettling magnetism inside a house where lineage mattered so much. Desire threatened exposure not because it was unprecedented, but because it was misdirected toward the child the family had hidden in plain sight. That is one of slavery's ugliest truths. It repeatedly manufactured conditions under which intimacy, coercion, kinship, and ownership became fatally entangled, then acted shocked when the resulting human relationships turned monstrous. Julian, for his part, mistook resistance for depth. Men like him often do. Clara's restraint made her more compelling to him. Her refusal to flirt, flatter, or appear flustered read not as self-protection, but as hidden feeling. By July 1860, he had begun seeking actual private speech. One account preserved through later oral testimony described him intercepting Clara near the back orchard and telling her she was not made for this kind of life. It sounded generous on the surface. It was not. Such remarks imply possession before rescue. They assume the man can diagnose a woman's condition and imagine himself central to changing it. In a slave society, that posture was especially dangerous. A white man could speak of freedom, affection, or exception while still benefiting from the legal machinery that held the woman in bondage. Clara's answer, according to that same account, was brief. "I was made for truth, sir, not for this house." Whether those exact words survived intact hardly matters. What matters is that she did not encourage him. She understood more than he did. Perhaps not the full biological truth yet, but enough to know that something diseased ran through Briar Oaks deeper than ordinary cruelty. Silas May understood the larger shape before anyone else did. To the old midwife, Julian's growing fixation on Clara was not merely a scandal waiting to happen. It was a symptom of the original fraud. The house had switched 2 girls and spent 18 years forcing everyone to act as though blood, law, and role still aligned. Now a young Beauregard man, trained to protect the family line, was emotionally drawn toward the very girl carrying that line in secret. The system had begun folding inward on itself. The false heiress occupied the front rooms. The true daughter carried trays through side doors. The heir's heart moved toward the hidden branch, while the public family tree remained a lie. Such a structure could not survive indefinitely. Desire had found the crack that paperwork could not seal. By August 1860, whispers had started. Not public accusations. Not yet. But the kind of whisper that destroys households faster than lawsuits. Why is Mr. Julian always near that Carter girl? Why does Mrs. Beauregard look ill when they cross paths? Why has Clara been removed from certain duties, then reassigned again? Even Father Luke Moreau, during a supper visit late that month, reportedly noticed unusual strain at table when Julian asked whether Clara might be taught more refined needlework for household use. The request sounded innocent. It was not. Everyone old enough to read the room felt the pressure beneath it. Helena remained, in some ways, the least prepared for what was unfolding. She saw Julian's distraction. She saw Clara's discomfort. But she did not yet see how deeply her own life sat inside the same web. That is one of the cruelest features of such frauds. The stolen child is often raised within privilege so complete that she cannot understand, until very late, the violence that created it. Helena was not the architect of the lie, but the lie had clothed her, educated her, and shielded her from truths paid for by Rose's suffering and Clara's deprivation. As autumn approached in September 1860, Edmund Beauregard began discussing the matter with Evelyn behind closed doors. Servants overheard fragments. Julian must be redirected. The girl must be kept in her place. Helena's future must not be disturbed. Again, notice the priorities. Not repentance, not recognition of Clara's danger, not acknowledgement of Rose's old wound. The family's concern was containment. Their morality extended only as far as reputation required. And this is where the record becomes especially instructive. Plantation society did not fear sin most when sin occurred. It feared sin when sin became visible to the wrong witnesses. Julian believed he was falling in love with a slave girl. In truth, he was walking straight toward the hidden heart of the family crime. Clara believed she was being pursued by another entitled white man, shaped by the same house that had ruined her mother. Rose believed history was preparing to repeat itself through a new male face. Evelyn believed the secret might burst through scandal. Edmund believed control could still repair what deceit had destabilized. And Silas May, old enough by then to understand timing better than anyone under that roof, saw the moment for what it was. Not an interruption of the lie, but its natural consequence. Because when a society builds family on rape, ownership, and falsified blood, it should not expect clean generations afterward. It should expect confusion, corruption, forbidden attachments shaped by hidden kinship, young people reaching for one another through identities imposed by crime. That is not fate, it is design. It is what happens when truth is strangled early and buried beneath race law. By the end of 1860, Julian's attachment to Clara had ceased to be a passing household concern. It had become a fuse. The house could still pretend. It could still move servants, stage dinners, assign duties, and speak of honor. But the moral geometry had changed. The true daughter of Briar Oaks was no longer invisible. The young man meant to extend the family's future had set his heart in the direction of the person the house most needed erased. And the old midwife, forced into silence 18 years earlier, was watching the same family that had threatened her now stumble toward exposure under the weight of its own deceit. The secret was no longer lying still in a nursery ledger. It was walking through corridors, speaking in half-finished sentences, and gathering force inside a courtship that should never have been possible in the first place. By January 1861, the household at Briar Oaks Plantation was no longer trying to preserve innocence. It was trying to preserve sequence. That distinction matters. No one inside that house believed the family was morally clean. They only believed scandal could still be managed if events were arranged in the correct order. First, silence. Then, distance. Then a respectable engagement. Then, perhaps, the old crime could be sealed beneath fresh ceremony and the parish would move on. That was the plan. It began in the first week of January 1861, when Evelyn Beauregard received 2 letters from relatives in New Orleans, and one from a Creole family near Opelousas. The letters discussed political unease, cotton prices, and militia rumors, but behind the formal language sat the matter Evelyn cared about most. Helena Beauregard had reached the age where her future had to be fixed publicly. The timing was not accidental. Julian Beauregard's growing attachment to Clara had become too visible to ignore. A household built on hidden blood had reached the point where desire was threatening to undo the paperwork. So the family turned to the oldest instrument available to people like them. Not truth, but performance. They would make Helena the center of an engagement. The intended groom, according to later accounts from parish recollections, was Adrien Delacroix, a 27-year-old widower from a landholding family with sugar interests further south along the Bayou Teche. He was not the most brilliant option, nor the richest. He was the safest. Old enough to appear stable, respectable enough to reassure the clergy, and sufficiently concerned with family connections to accept what the Beauregards presented without probing too deeply. Men like Adrien rarely married for mystery. They married for name, alliance, acreage, and the promise that no public embarrassment would follow. To Evelyn, that made him useful. To Edmund, the calculation was even simpler. A formal engagement would redirect conversation. If Helena was promised, attention would shift toward linens, settlements, jewelry, guest lists, church arrangements. Julian could be separated from Clara under the cover of domestic busyness. And Helena, the stolen child raised as heir, could be moved deeper into the public role that made questioning her nearly impossible. Once another family attached itself to the fraud, exposure would become costlier for everyone. This is how plantation evil evolved. It did not correct wrongdoing. It multiplied stakeholders. By January 10, 1861, Helena had been told enough to understand that her future was now under management. She was not asked, in any modern sense. Girls in such houses were consulted only within the boundaries of obedience. Still, Helena seems to have accepted the attention with the composure she had been trained to display. She had spent 18 years being dressed into a story she did not create. She knew how to sit for fittings, how to answer polite inquiries, how to lower her eyes without appearing weak. But beneath that performance, a tension had begun to grow in her. She had noticed Julian's distance. She had noticed the household's nervous rearrangement of Clara's duties. And if she did not yet know the truth, she knew enough to sense that her engagement was arriving with unusual haste. Clara understood the meaning faster. On plantations, enslaved women learned to read the sudden elegance of white households as a warning sign. New curtains, extra silver polishing, visits from the priest, unexpected dress orders, discussions of carriage routes in guest chambers, none of it was neutral. Ceremony often meant concealment. By the middle of January, Clara had been shifted away from several indoor tasks and reassigned to work that kept her moving between the laundry, storage room, and side galleries. Not because her labor was less needed inside, but because her presence near Helena and Julian had become intolerable to the family. That reassignment told its own story. When the powerful begin moving people around like objects on a board, it is usually because truth has started appearing in the wrong places. Rose Carter watched all of this with the kind of dread that only repetition can produce. She had already seen one crime dressed as necessity on the night of October 3rd, 1842. Now, nearly 19 years later, she was watching another layer of theft, prepared in satin and prayer. If Helena entered a formal engagement under the Beauregard name, the original switch would be dragged further into permanence. Another family would bless it. Lawyers might reference it. Priests would speak it aloud before witnesses. The child taken from Rose's body after rape would be used once again as social capital for the very class that had violated her. That is why the word engagement should not be mistaken here for romance. At Briar Oaks, it was evidence disposal, and Silas May Carter understood that more clearly than anyone. The old midwife, now nearing 65, had watched the house move through every stage of denial: the assault, the switch, the silence, the grooming of Helena, the reduction of Clara into property, Julian's fixation, Evelyn's panic. By January 1861, she could see the final mechanism taking shape. Once Helena was publicly promised, the lie would become harder to unravel, not because it was true, but because too many respectable names would be invested in preserving it. That is how false histories survive. They attach themselves to ceremony, and ceremony persuades people to worship what they should investigate. So Silas May began preparing. There is no surviving diary from her hand, no signed confession, no dramatic speech preserved in ink. Women like Silas May were denied that kind of historical luxury. What remains is the logic of her actions and the testimony that later clustered around them. In the second half of January, she was seen lifting a loose floorboard in her cabin after dark. A young boy from the quarters later recalled carrying a wrapped bundle for her to the loft of an unused smokehouse. An older house servant remembered seeing Silas May stare for a long time at the nursery corridor while holding a worn strip of linen between both hands. These details might seem small. They are not. Large reckonings are often assembled from humble objects. By this time, Silas May had preserved at least 3 pieces of material proof from the original crime. First, the linen wrap edged in blue thread that Rose Carter had sewn before giving birth in 1842. A cloth that briefly accompanied the child later presented as Helena. Second, a broken baptism seal fragment linked to the irregular parish entry made the week after the births. Third, a small silver rattle, reportedly engraved with the initials E.B., which had been placed near the wrong infant during the hurried exchange before sunrise. None of these objects, on their own, would have satisfied a court dominated by white property interests, but public scandal does not always require courtroom standards. Sometimes it needs only enough evidence to make denial look panicked, and panic was already inside the house. By January 18th, Evelyn had begun consulting Father Luke Moreau more often. The priest was invited for supper twice in 1 week. Officially, the conversations concerned the moral climate of the country and appropriate timing for formal announcements amid political instability. In truth, Evelyn wanted a church-shaped shield around the family. Priests offered more than blessing. They offered legitimacy by tone. If Moreau treated the engagement as natural, most of the parish would follow. His presence could drown whispers simply by standing in the right room at the right hour. Moral institutions often do their worst work not by inventing lies, but by lending them posture. Edmond, meanwhile, handled the legal flank. He met with Etienne Broussard, a notary from Opelousas, sometime around January 21, 1861, to discuss preliminary settlement language. Such meetings were not unusual before an engagement between landed families, but here the paperwork carried a foul irony. Men were drafting terms around Helena's future as though her place in the Beauregard line were beyond question, while the true daughter of that line carried water in the side yard and avoided the gaze of Julian Beauregard whenever possible. Property law was not correcting the deception. It was preparing to certify it again. Julian responded badly to these developments. By late January, he understood that Helena's engagement was not just a family celebration, it was also a wall being built around him. He was no fool in the practical sense. He knew the announcement would force him into an expected role: supportive cousin, dutiful male relation, disciplined member of the house. More importantly, it would close whatever fantasy he had been building around Clara. Not because slavery had made such desire immoral from the start, though it had, but because the family had finally judged his attachment too dangerous to tolerate. That did not make him noble. It made him frustrated. Accounts suggest that around January 24th, Julian tried again to speak privately with Clara near the old garden wall behind the dairy sheds. He reportedly asked whether she had heard of Helena's coming match, and whether all hearts in this house were meant to be assigned by others. The phrasing is revealing. He still spoke as though the situation were tragic in a literary sense, as if he were a man denied authentic feeling by family strategy. What he refused to confront was more basic. Clara had no freedom in the matter at all. He could lament. She could be punished. He could imagine romance. She had to calculate survival. Plantation men often turned their own appetite into poetry, because poetry hid the power imbalance they benefited from. Clara did not give him the response he wanted. Witnesses later recalled only that she left abruptly, and that Julian struck the brick with his palm after she went. No confession of love, no secret pact, no tender exchange. That matters because such stories are often softened afterward into doomed romance. But Clara's position was not romantic. It was perilous. She knew the family was tightening around something. She knew Helena's engagement meant the house was choosing its official future. And somewhere beneath all of that, she carried the old, unspoken feeling that her own life had been bent around a truth others were desperate to suppress. Helena, for her part, was being prepared like a document. On January 26th, a seamstress from town arrived to adjust bodices and discuss engagement garments. Jewelry boxes were opened, pearls were compared. Evelyn selected a pale dress for the first formal gathering and instructed Helena on where to stand, whom to thank, how long to hold Adrienne Delacroix's hand in public view. This is how women of planter households were often trained, not as daughters first, but as symbols of orderly transfer. Helena's tragedy was that she had been made into that symbol through a theft she did not yet understand. She was both beneficiary and victim of the lie, sheltered by it, shaped by it, and prepared to carry it forward. Rose saw the noose tightening around all of them. Silas May saw the opening. By January 30th, 1861, the old midwife had made at least one contact outside the immediate household. Later testimony points to an aging former nursemaid named Aunt Sabine, who had once worked in the Beauregard nursery and had seen enough on the night of the births to remain dangerous if ever emboldened. Silas May could not speak, but she could signal, write crude marks, press objects into hands, and guide memory where words failed. She understood that a revelation delivered alone by a mute black woman would be easier for the family to crush. A revelation supported by objects, by another surviving witness, and by the grief of Rose Carter would be harder to contain. This was not impulse. It was method. And the engagement itself offered the perfect stage. A private accusation could be buried. A confrontation in the quarters could be whipped out of existence. But a scandal in front of guests, relatives, clergy, and a prospective groom's family, that threatened the one thing the Beauregards valued as much as land: public standing. Silas May had spent nearly 19 years being treated as if muteness meant helplessness. Now she was preparing to use the family's own ceremony against them. The household, of course, sensed none of this clearly. Powerful people often fail at the exact point where they believe themselves safest. They mistake outward calm for control. A mistress who chose preservation over truth. A priest willing to bless what he did not challenge. A young heir tangled in desire for the very girl the family most needed to erase. And an old midwife, still carrying the first night in her bones, now deciding that silence would no longer protect anyone except the guilty. So when the Beauregards prepared their announcement in early February 1861, they believed they were closing a breach. In reality, they were building a stage for detonation. They thought the engagement would redirect the household toward respectable future arrangements. They thought Adrienne Delacroix's name, Father Moreau's presence, and Etienne Broussard's papers would seal the old switch beneath fresh approval. They thought Helena would stand in the right place, Clara would remain in the shadows, Rose would endure, Julian would submit, and Silas May would die with the secret still locked behind her teeth. That was their final misreading. Because crimes preserved by ceremony do not become holy, they become heavier. And when they finally collapse, they do so in front of everyone the guilty most wanted to impress. On the afternoon of February 14, 1861, the Beauregard house at Briar Oaks Plantation was arranged to perform innocence. Silver was laid out in the front dining room. Candles were trimmed, though sunset was still hours away. Fresh flowers had been cut from the winter garden and placed where they could soften the severity of the old furniture. The front gallery had been swept twice. In the parlor, chairs were angled for witnesses rather than comfort. That detail matters. Families like the Beauregards did not host such gatherings merely to celebrate. They staged them to be seen, arranging themselves correctly. The occasion, on paper, was simple: the formal presentation of Helena Beauregard's engagement to Adrian Delacroix. But that afternoon did not belong to Helena. It belonged to the hidden dead weight of October 1842, now rising through floorboards, memory, and flesh. Guests began arriving shortly after 3 o'clock. Among them were members of the Delacroix family from the Bayou Teche district, local planter couples from St. Landry Parish, a notary, Etienne Broussard, and Father Luc Moreau, whose presence was meant to wrap the event in moral legitimacy before anyone had spoken a vow. Julien Beauregard was already in the house, tense and formal, moving through the rooms like a man who understood he was being watched. Evelyn Beauregard wore dark silk and composure like armor. Edmund Beauregard, then 55, played host with the brittle control of someone who believed money, posture, and timing could still outrun history. And in the service corridors, Clara was kept moving. She carried trays, folded linens, and refilled glasses, not because her labor was uniquely required, but because the family preferred to hide people in plain sight. That was an old plantation method: keep the threatened person near enough to control, busy enough to silence, visible enough to normalize. Clara, by then 18, understood the insult clearly. The house that had denied her name now expected her to circulate through the edges of a ceremony built on that theft. Every tray she lifted was part of the same lie. Every guest who admired Helena's grace was admiring a role stolen from someone standing 3 rooms away. Rose Carter had been ordered to remain away from the main rooms until needed in the back service yard. But orders lose some of their power when the years have already taken almost everything. Rose had reached a point beyond fear's first usefulness. She no longer mistook survival for safety. She knew something was coming because Silas May Carter had begun signaling with unusual urgency over the previous 2 nights, touching the floor twice, then her chest, holding up the old linen, tracing a cradle shape in the air. The old midwife could not describe the plan in words, but Rose understood enough. The time for endurance had ended. The time for naming had come. That is the difference the powerful often fail to grasp. They assume silence is loyalty, when it is sometimes only delayed timing. By 4:30, the first toast had been discussed, but not yet raised. Helena sat where Evelyn had placed her, dressed in pale fabric chosen to suggest both purity and rank. Adrian Delacroix stood beside her, respectable and self-satisfied, one hand resting on the back of her chair as though proximity already granted claim. He did not know he had been invited into a fraud, or perhaps, more accurately, he did not know the depth of it. Men of his class often knew enough about plantations to suspect rot and still chose not to inspect it. Social order depended on that selective blindness. Father Moreau offered brief remarks about family continuity, duty, and blessing. Such language should be remembered with suspicion. Under slavery, piety was often used not to challenge evil but to perfume it. The priest's phrases floated over a room built from coercion. A raped woman's child was being paraded as legitimate inheritance. The true daughter of the house was carrying drinks through a side doorway, and a clergyman spoke of divine order. Then Silas May entered. There was nothing theatrical in the way she moved, no dramatic rush, no screaming interruption, no grand gesture designed for spectacle. That is what makes the moment more severe. She walked with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had rehearsed the burden of every step. In her hands was a wrapped bundle of old cloth. Behind her came Aunt Sabine, the retired nursemaid whose memory had outlived the family's comfort, and then, several seconds later, Rose Carter herself. Conversation thinned first, then stopped. It is easy from a distance to imagine that truth arrives through eloquence. Often it does not. Often it arrives by making the room notice the wrong people at the wrong time. A mute black midwife standing in the center of a planter engagement gathering was already a breach. Rose's presence behind her turned breach into accusation. Aunt Sabine turned it into corroboration. Edmund rose immediately. Witness accounts later differed on his first words, but all agreed on the tone, command before explanation. He demanded that the women be removed. He called for order. He looked not at Silas May first, but at the servants nearest the door, because men like him trusted systems more than conscience. But the room had shifted too quickly. Guests were standing. Adrian had stepped back from Helena. Julian had gone pale. Evelyn did not move at all. Silas May crossed to the center table and laid down the bundle. When she unfolded it, the first item visible was the linen wrap edged in blue thread. Old. Preserved. Stained by time rather than fresh blood. Rose recognized it at once. So did Aunt Sabine. The nursemaid said the name out loud before anyone could stop her. That was the Carter child's cloth. Not a theory, not a polite observation. A statement. The first clean blade. Then came the silver rattle engraved with E.B. Aunt Sabine, trembling but resolute, testified in the only way such women were ever permitted to testify. In memory, offered aloud before people too respectable to pretend they had heard nothing. She stated that on the night of October 3rd to 4th, 1842, she had seen that rattle near the infant in the mistress's room, then later seen it in the wrong cradle after the dawn exchange. She said she had been ordered never to speak of it. She said the babies had not remained where they were born. She said the old midwife had been forced. By then, the room had already divided into camps of disbelief, fear, and immediate comprehension. Helena stared at the objects without touching them. Clara, still in service dress near the doorway, had gone motionless. Julian looked from one young woman to the other as if the geometry of the house had been ripped away in front of him. Adrien Delacroix, to his credit or his cowardice, said nothing. Men invited into scandal often become most eloquent through silence. Rose stepped forward next. She did what the law had denied her for nearly 19 years. She identified her child. Not with poetry, not with melodrama, with the plain force of a mother naming what had been stolen. She pointed first to Helena and said that child had come from her body after Edmund Beauregard forced himself on her again and again in the summer of 1841 and into 1842. Then she turned to Clara and said the other girl had been carried out of Evelyn's room before sunrise and entered into slavery under a false place. Rose's voice, according to later recollections, did not break until the second name. That detail should be kept, not because tears prove truth, but because dignity under long oppression often sounds most terrible when it remains controlled. Edmund tried then to crush the scene by force. He called Rose a liar. He called Silas May mad. He said age had corrupted Aunt Sabine's memory. He appealed to Father Moreau. He appealed to Broussard the notary. He even appealed to the indecency of raising such matters in front of guests, as if the crime were not the switching of infants and rape of an enslaved woman, but the inconvenience of hearing it during refreshments. That is how power often behaves when exposed. It invokes procedure only after violating everything sacred. But the objects were there. The witnesses were there. And worst of all for the Beauregards, the faces were there. Guests looked from Helena to Rose, from Clara to Edmund, from Clara to Evelyn. Resemblance, long suppressed by etiquette, suddenly became public evidence. What servants had whispered for years could now be seen without permission. Clara carried the Beauregard line too clearly. Helena carried Rose too plainly once the possibility had been spoken aloud. The lie, protected for nearly 2 decades by category and terror, collapsed under the simplest human instrument. The eye finally allowed to interpret what it had seen. Evelyn broke next, though not into confession in any noble sense. She sat down abruptly and pressed one gloved hand against the table as if the wood itself had turned unstable. Some said she whispered, "It was necessary." If she did, that phrase should be remembered exactly as an indictment. Necessary for whom? Necessary to preserve what? The answer was the whole structure of planter morality. Necessary to keep a family name clean at the cost of a black woman's child. Necessary to demote a biological daughter into property because white society preferred a manageable fiction to a visible stain. Necessary to cooperate with evil because social ruin frightened her more than injustice revolted her. Women in such houses were often constrained, yes, but constraint is not innocence. Evelyn had chosen preservation over truth every day since 1842. Julian moved toward Clara and stopped halfway. That hesitation tells its own story. Until that moment, he had imagined himself entangled in a tragic desire across class and bondage. Now he understood something more obscene. The girl he had wanted was not merely an enslaved woman wronged by his family. She was the true daughter of the house, hidden under stolen status. The attraction he had draped in sentiment now stood exposed as one more consequence of the family's fraud. He was not the romantic victim of a cruel system. He was another young man shaped by it, walking blindly toward contamination because older people had built his world from lies. Helena's position was no less devastating. She had been raised as a lady, educated, protected, and prepared for marriage under a name bought with Rose's violation and Clara's dispossession. In an instant, every lesson, every kindness, every privilege was contaminated. She was not guilty of arranging the switch, but innocence did not save her from its consequences. She was both beloved fraud and stolen child. That is one of slavery's most vicious features. It ruined identity not only for the openly oppressed, but for everyone forced to live inside fabricated kinship. Father Moreau did what compromised moral men often do in moments like this. Too little, too late. He attempted to calm the room, urged private discussion, warned against public disorder. But public disorder was the only honest thing left. Private discussion had served the guilty for 19 years. Privacy had protected rape, infant theft, fraudulent lineage, false baptism, coerced silence. The old order's favorite shelter was secrecy. Silas May had come precisely to strip that shelter away, and she did not need speech to finish the work. After Rose and Aunt Sabine had spoken, Silas May placed one hand on Helena's shoulder, then the other on Clara's. Then she pointed at Rose, then at Edmund. Then she struck the table once with her open palm. It was crude, undeniable, and more morally precise than any sermon Father Moreau had ever delivered in that house. These are the mother, the daughters, and the man who caused it. Record that. Do not soften it. The engagement gathering never recovered. Adrien Delacroix withdrew from Helena with the practical speed of a man protecting his own family from contamination. Guests began leaving in fragments, carrying the scandal out into the parish before sunset. Broussard refused to proceed with any formal notation under such circumstances. Julian left the room and did not return for the remainder of the evening. Evelyn retreated behind silence. Edmund continued raging, but rage sounds different once people have seen enough to stop believing you. And Clara stood in the center of the wreckage of her own stolen life. Not crowned, not restored, not suddenly free in any full legal sense. That should be said plainly. Revelations do not instantly repair systems. A black woman publicly identified as the true daughter of a white planter house did not magically receive justice in Louisiana in 1861. But truth had changed hands that day. It no longer belonged only to the guilty. It had entered the hearing of witnesses. It had attached itself to names, dates, objects, and faces. That matters. Exposure is not the same as redemption, but it is often the first blow against a lie fortified by power. So remember the shape of this afternoon correctly. It was not a family misunderstanding, not an unfortunate confusion at birth, not a dramatic accident of old Southern life. It was the excavation of a deliberate crime. A raped, enslaved woman robbed of her child, a biological daughter reduced to property, a mistress who helped preserve the theft, a churchman who had blessed around it, a young household nearly twisted into fresh scandal by concealed blood, and a mute midwife who understood that when law protects the guilty, public memory must become the court. The grave of the past had been opened in the parlor of Briar Oaks, and once opened, it could no longer be resealed with lace, prayer, or polite speech. By nightfall on February 14, 1861, the engagement table at Briar Oaks Plantation was no longer a place of announcement. It had become an exhibit of moral collapse. The silver remained on the linen. The candles still burned. Half-filled glasses stood where guests had abandoned them. But the ceremony was dead. What remained alive was accusation. Not rumor, Not suspicion. Accusation with names, objects, witnesses, and faces that could no longer be arranged into silence. That distinction matters. For nearly 19 years, the Beauregards had depended on a system designed to make truth look unofficial. Rose Carter had no legal standing equal to the people who harmed her. Silas May Carter had no voice the courts would honor. Clara had no name the ledgers would protect. And yet, in one public rupture, the balance shifted. The family that had relied on status, church respectability, and race law now faced something it feared more than private guilt: visible disgrace. The first person to understand the full force of that disgrace was not Edmund Beauregard. Men like Edmund rarely understand moral judgment when it first arrives. They understand inconvenience, threat, insult, exposure. He kept shouting long after the room had already decided he was finished. He called for servants. He demanded the women be dragged out. He cursed Aunt Sabine as senile, Rose as vindictive, Silas May as deceitful, but every denial came too late. His own face had betrayed him. Not in confession, but in panic. Panic is often the closest thing the guilty offer to proof. He had raped Rose Carter. That fact had been buried since 1842 under the language of Plantation order. Now it stood in the parlor with nowhere left to hide. Worse for him, the consequences of that violence had become visible in two grown women standing on opposite sides of the same room. Helena, raised in privilege, carried Rose's blood. Clara, raised as property, carried the Beauregard line. Edmund had not merely committed assault. He had reorganized maternity, inheritance, and human rank to conceal it. That is the charge history should keep against him. Not lust, not weakness, administration of evil. Evelyn Beauregard collapsed in a different way. She did not scream. She did not fight. She shrank inward, which often happens when people who have long confused composure with virtue discover that composure can no longer control the room. She had spent nearly 2 decades performing the role of mother to the wrong child and mistress over the right one. She had selected Helena's dresses, planned her lessons, corrected her manners, and displayed her at church suppers as living proof of family continuity. At the same time, she had watched Clara pass through the house as unpaid labor, watched Rose swallow grief until it hardened into silence, and chosen daily to protect the lie rather than confront the crime. That record matters because Evelyn's guilt was not theatrical. It was bureaucratic, repeated, domestic, respectable. The kind of guilt history too often excuses in women of her class by calling them trapped. She may well have been trapped by marriage, by patriarchy, by dependence, but entrapment does not erase collaboration. She did not stop the switch on October 4th, 1842. She did not correct it on October 5th. She did not confess in 1848 or 1855 or 1860. She chose the maintenance of white respectability over the restoration of a stolen child. That choice deserves record. Helena sat inside the ruin of an identity she had never been allowed to examine. There is a cruelty specific to stories like this. The stolen child is not guilty of the theft, but must live with its inheritance once exposed. Helena had not arranged Rose's rape. She had not commanded the exchange. She had not written Clara into the ledger as property. But she had been fed, educated, and cherished through a fraud built on all three. In a single evening, the meaning of every comfort she had known shifted under her. The nursery became a crime scene. Her baptism became an altered record. Her engagement dress became costume. Even the tenderness she had received from Evelyn was contaminated because it had been offered under a false name, while Clara was denied the same protection. And then there was the greater wound. Rose was her mother. Not in sentiment, in blood, in pain, in history. The woman who had moved through the plantation as an enslaved figure under discipline was the woman whose body had borne her after repeated assaults by Edmund Beauregard. Helena was the living evidence of that violence, raised not as a reminder of it, but as a shield against it. Once that truth was spoken aloud, she could not return to innocence. No one in that room could. Clara received a different kind of devastation. For 18 years, she had lived the consequences of an unnamed theft without being given the language for it. She had sensed the distortion. She had seen how eyes lingered on her face. She had felt how strangely the house reacted to her presence. But revelation does not always feel like rescue when it finally arrives. Sometimes it feels like confirmation that the injury was even deeper than feared. Clara was not merely a girl treated unjustly by the Beauregards. She was the biological daughter of the very family that had reduced her to human inventory. Her labor, her discipline, her vulnerability to sale and sexual threat, none of it had been accidental hardship. It had been the deliberate demotion of a white planter's daughter into property for the sake of social camouflage. That should be remembered without euphemism. She was not raised below her station. She was enslaved by her own bloodline's fraud. When the guests finally began to scatter into the evening, they carried more than gossip. They carried evidence of how slavery corrupted every category it claimed to defend: family, law, religion, inheritance, marriage, womanhood. None of these remained clean at Briar Oaks. The house had taken the language of civilization and used it to sanitize rape, infant theft, and legal impersonation. That is why such stories must be told in the register of accusation, not nostalgia. Too many old Southern narratives still speak of family houses as if their tragedies were private misfortunes. They were public systems. Their crimes were architectural. Julian Beauregard understood this too late. All through 1860, he had imagined himself living through a thwarted attachment to an enslaved woman whose difference from Helena made her seem more real, more compelling, more alive. But his attraction was never evidence of higher feeling. It was evidence that the family's fraud had poisoned kinship so thoroughly that desire itself began moving along falsified lines. He had been drawn toward Clara without knowing she was the true daughter of the house. He had treated his own longing as a kind of personal tragedy, when in fact it was one more aftershock of the original crime. Slavery had hidden blood and rewritten ranks so completely that younger generations could stumble into moral contamination while calling it love. That does not absolve him. It indicts the world that formed him. Adrienne Delacroix, the prospective fiancé, withdrew with the speed of a man trained to protect his interests first. By the next morning, according to later parish recollection, the Delacroix family had already sent word that no formal union could proceed under such confusion. Notice the phrasing. Not outrage at Rose's assault, not horror at Clara's enslavement, confusion. The language of respectable people seeking distance from scandal without naming the underlying evil. That, too, is part of the record. Slave society's allies were not only the violent, they were also the polite. Father Luc Moreau fared little better. His role in the catastrophe was quieter, but no less instructive. He had baptized Helena in 1842. He had blessed the house for years. He had appeared at the engagement as if his presence could sanctify what had been built on coercion. When the truth erupted, he tried to lower the temperature rather than elevate the moral charge. That is what compromised institutions often do. They confuse peace with righteousness because peace protects their authority. But peace without justice is simply better upholstered silence. So the final moral center of the evening belonged not to the priest, not to the planter, not to the notary, not to the assembled guests. It belonged to Silas May Carter. The mute midwife they had used as an instrument in 1842 became, in 1861, the instrument of exposure. That reversal should not be romanticized as neat justice. Her life had not been restored. Her silence had not been kindly borne, it had been exploited. She had lived 19 years with the memory of 2 infants in her hands, 1 order in her ears, and the knowledge that her own survival had been purchased through obedience to a monstrous act. But when the moment came, she refused to let the house write the last line of the story. That is the lesson worth keeping. Power often assumes the most marginalized witness is the easiest to erase. The enslaved mother can be threatened. The old servant can be dismissed. The mute woman can be ignored. But sometimes, those same people become the only surviving archive more honest than the ledger. They remember what the law was written to distort. They carry the sequence the respectable buried. And when they finally act, they do not merely embarrass the guilty. They reorder memory itself. At Briar Oaks, the secret did not explode because fate demanded drama. It exploded because the lie had been stretched across too many human lives for too long. Rose could not remain only the violated mother. Clara could not remain only the enslaved girl with the wrong face. Helena could not remain only the polished daughter of a false record. Julian could not remain only the young heir playing at forbidden feeling. And Silas May could not remain only the silent witness. The engagement table became the place where every assigned role failed at once. That failure did not produce full justice. This was still Louisiana in 1861. War was approaching. Race law still stood. Plantations did not dissolve because a truth was spoken in one parlor. Clara was not instantly granted legal freedom by the revelation of blood. Rose did not receive back the 19 years stolen from her. Helena could not simply step into a stable self once the old one shattered. Exposure is not the same as repair. It is only the point at which denial loses ownership of the narrative. But that point matters profoundly. Because after February 14, 1861, no one in that parish could speak of the Beauregards as if they represented order, without also carrying the stain of what had been revealed. No one could admire Helena's upbringing without recalling the mother from whom she was taken. No one could look at Clara without seeing the indictment carved into her face. No one could hear Evelyn's name without wondering what she had traded to preserve it. And no one could remember the engagement gathering without knowing that an old mute midwife had done what church, law, and family had refused to do. She named the crime in public. That is how this story should be kept. Not as sensational tragedy, though it was tragic. Not as romantic Gothic, though old houses tempt that kind of lie. But as record. Slavery did not only steal labor. It stole lineage, children, legitimacy, and language. It turned rape into household management. It turned inheritance into fraud. It turned mothers into spectators of their own dispossession. Then it expected the world to admire the silver. Do not admire the silver. Remember what was hidden beneath it. Subscribe if you believe buried crimes should be named, not softened. And comment your location below with your theory. Was Silas May delivering justice, revenge, or the only truth that house ever deserved to hear?